Take a quick glance at your watch for a second, or maybe the clock on your phone. Notice how the minute is split into exactly 60 seconds? Well, that incredibly specific way of measuring time wasn't just dreamt up recently. It was actually invented thousands of years ago in a place that functioned a lot like the Silicon Valley of the ancient world, Mesopotamia. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to unpack the secrets of human history's ultimate innovators and see exactly how their brilliant ideas literally still shape our daily lives.
Okay, let's dive into this. We'll be looking at 5 key areas today. First, the cradle of civilization. Second, life in ancient cities. Third, the agricultural economic engine. Fourth, innovations that changed everything. And finally, the unexpected decline.
Section 1. The Cradle of Civilization. Geographic Origins.
So, what does Mesopotamia actually mean? It's a Greek word, and it translates directly to the land between two rivers. And historians often refer to this specific region as both the cradle and the grave of many civilizations. Now, you might be wondering why a grave? Well, because between roughly 3500 BCE and 600 BCE, this area wasn't just home to one single static group of people. It saw several brilliant civilizations rise up, totally flourish, and then eventually fall. It started with the Sumerians, who actually developed the world's very first civilization, and they were followed later by the Babylonians and finally the Assyrians.
And this brilliantly illustrates exactly why early humans decided to settle down here in the first place. If you look at West Asia, there's this broad, incredibly fertile valley nestled right between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Early nomadic hunter-gatherers didn't just stop here randomly. They stopped for a really practical reason. See, the Tigris and Euphrates ran parallel to each other, and they would frequently overflow their banks. And when they did, they deposited this rich, alluvial silt all along the lower reaches of the plain. So you have an abundant water supply mixed with incredibly fertile land, which is basically the ultimate recipe for a thriving human settlement.
Moving on to Section 2. Life in Ancient Cities. Monumental Architecture.
It's amazing to contrast the modern-day ruins of a historic city like Babylon with what they used to build, like the massive, imposing ziggurat of Ur. What's absolutely fascinating here is that excavations show us these Mesopotamian cities followed a really uniform pattern of town planning. It's like a giant puzzle that always fits together the same way. They were structurally divided into 3 main parts. First, you had the sacred area, and that housed the massive temple tower, the ziggurat, which was dedicated to the patron god of the city. Then you had the walled cities situated on a mound, and finally, the outer town. People lived pretty securely in that walled city and outer town, in houses that were built around central courtyards.
But the physical structure of their cities actually mirrored the rigid structure of their society. Mesopotamian society was firmly divided into 3 strict classes. The upper class consisted of the royal family, the priests, and high officials. The middle class was made up of farmers, artisans, and traders, and it's definitely worth noting that the vast majority of the population were farmers. And then finally, the lower class consisted of slaves. Within their family units, the father was the recognized head of the household, and their education system was highly structured too. Boys were sent off to schools to study reading, writing, and arithmetic, while girls were trained in dance and music.
Section 3. The Agricultural Economic Engine. Ingenious Farming.
Let's move to and see how this builds into an absolute economic powerhouse through a pretty brilliant chain of cause and effect. Remember those 2 rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates? Well, their flooding was highly irregular. It wasn't something you could easily plan around. So to ensure a steady water supply all year round, the Mesopotamians were basically forced to invent elaborate irrigation systems and dikes just to control the floods. And this incredible engineering led to massive surplus food production. This is absolute crucial, right? That surplus is where civilization really takes off. Because they suddenly had abundant food, the entire population didn't have to spend every waking hour toiling in the fields. It freed up their time to develop specialized, highly skilled crafts, things like beautiful pottery, intricate weaving, and metalwork for jewelry and armor.
To actually achieve that kind of agricultural surplus, they had to develop some major technological inventions. They weren't just out there planting seeds by hand and hoping for the best. To significantly bump up their crop yields, they invented the ox-drawn plow, which completely revolutionized farming as they knew it. They're also believed to be the very first humans to cultivate wheat, right alongside barley and pulses. But perhaps their most game-changing invention, one that was used heavily in both agriculture and trade, was the wheeled wagon. This was huge. It allowed them to transport all those extra goods easily and efficiently.
Section 4. Innovations that changed everything. Shaping modern life.
Now, what's really interesting about this is just one single number, 60. Remember our little hook at the very beginning of this explainer about checking your watch?
Well, the Mesopotamians were highly skilled mathematicians, but instead of just counting in tens like we usually do today, they also counted in 60s. They actually used the figure 60 as their base unit to measure time. They were literally the very first people in human history to divide an hour into 60 minutes, and a minute into 60 seconds. They even went as far as dividing the year into 12 months, and split days and nights into 2 equal halves of 12 hours each.
But they didn't just measure and track time, they recorded incredible amounts of information. The Mesopotamians invented a super sophisticated system of writing known as cuneiform, which translates to wedge-shaped. They wrote from left to right using a stylus, which was this sharp pen made out of reeds, bone, or metal, and they'd press it right into the smooth, soft surface of clay tablets. Then, they baked those tablets in a fire to harden them up. Every single clay tablet basically functioned like a page in a book, and this allowed them to record everything from mundane, everyday business accounts to entirely complete books.
They also used this written language to establish strict societal order. There's a fascinating excerpt from the Code of Hammurabi that reads, "If a wife does not wish to remain in her husband's house, then he shall compensate her for the dowry, and she may go." Hammurabi, who was the king of Babylon, compiled this massive code of law that dealt with pretty much every aspect of human life. Written down on a stone slab, it remains one of the oldest legal codes known to humans, and our sources note that these laws specifically contained provisions that protected the poor and the weak and safeguarded specific rights of women in their society.
Section size, the unexpected decline, a forgotten culture.
So the crucial point is that nature, which originally gave them life, ultimately took it away. The Euphrates River, which was the absolute lifeline of this great civilization, unexpectedly changed its course, and without that vital water source, their highly developed, brilliant irrigation systems were just completely useless. The inhabitants were literally forced to totally abandon the site. Over time, fierce winds and sandstorms eroded the city walls and buried their magnificent monuments. It hid the treasures of this entire great civilization beneath a sandy desert plain, where it stayed completely forgotten until its rediscovery much later. We've seen how they harnessed wild, unpredictable rivers, invented the wheel, meticulously tracked time, and coded laws to organize a complex society. Which leaves us with this final, truly provocative question. Can we use the creative problem-solving spirit of the Mesopotamians to find solutions to today's major environmental problems? Think about it. They engineered their way out of irregular flooding to build a thriving, ancient Silicon Valley. As we face our own immense modern environmental shifts, perhaps the ultimate lesson from these ancient innovators is that focused human ingenuity can overcome nearly any obstacle. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, and I'll catch you on the next one.